You meet someone new. They tell you their name. You smile, nod, and say, "Nice to meet you." And 5 seconds later, that name has already disappeared from your head. Maybe you even repeat it silently, trying to make it stick, and yet it slips away. You feel embarrassed. You feel like you failed at something basic, something any normal person should be able to do effortlessly. But here's what's fascinating. Dolphins call other dolphins by their names. Every bottlenose dolphin develops its own unique whistle from a very young age, and the other dolphins in its group use exactly that whistle to address it. Researchers at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, led by biologist Vincent Yannick, have been documenting this since the early 2000s. They didn't learn it from us. They were doing it millions of years before a single human ever spoke a single word. So the real question isn't why you forget names. The question is something else. What would happen if no one, anywhere, had ever thought of giving another person a name? Today, we're going to look at 3 things. How this may have started long before language. Why some cultures prohibited saying certain names out loud. And why your brain is, quite literally, still designed for a world much smaller than the one you live in today. For a long time, people believed that identifying an individual by name was something uniquely human. In 2024, researchers from Colorado State University and the organization Save the Elephants published a finding that challenged that idea. They analyzed hundreds of calls made by wild elephants in Kenya and discovered something strange. Elephants weren't simply producing generic sounds to communicate with one another. They were using specific, distinct vocalizations directed at particular elephants, something resembling a proper name. When researchers played that call near the corresponding elephant, it responded, turned its head, and approached. Near another elephant, the reaction was much weaker. And they aren't the only ones. For decades, primatologists have documented that many primates recognize and interact differently with each member of their group, even though they don't have spoken language to express it out loud. Recognizing an individual seems to come long before naming that individual with words. In humans, the earliest evidence doesn't come from words. Words don't leave fossils. It comes from graves. In Shanidar Cave, in what is now Iraq, archaeologist Ralph Seletsky excavated, during the 1950s, the remains of Neanderthals who lived approximately 60,000 years ago and had been deliberately buried with care. This wasn't a body discarded like garbage. It was someone treated as though they mattered enough to be remembered after death, and to remember someone as an individual. At some point in history, it took more than a gesture. It required a sound reserved specifically for that person, a name. But having a name for one special person is one thing. Having a different name for every person in your group is something entirely different. For more than 95% of our species' history, humans lived in small groups, bands of 25 to 50 people, hunting together, gathering together, and moving together from one place to another. In a group like that, a name wasn't just a word. It was almost sacred. Among Inuit peoples, there is a concept called atiq, the idea that a name carries a kind of essence or soul capable of passing from a person who has died to a newborn baby. Giving a baby the name of a deceased grandparent wasn't simply an act of tribute. In a sense, it was bringing that person back into the community. In some of these communities, the baby's permanent name wasn't even decided on the day of birth. Instead, it was chosen later, after observing the child's character for weeks, as if the right name had to be discovered rather than simply chosen. And in some Aboriginal Australian communities, the exact opposite happens. After someone dies, their name stops being spoken altogether. For months, sometimes years, saying that name aloud is forbidden, not because of a lack of respect, because of an excess of it. The name hurts too much to say out loud. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. In a group of 25 to 50 people, you knew every name, all of them, the names of every person you were going to interact with throughout your entire life. There were no strangers whose names you had to remember 5 seconds after meeting them. At most, there were around 150 people in your entire world, and you knew every one of them individually. That began to change when human groups stopped being bands and became something larger. Villages, cities, empires, and that's when the name stopped being solely yours. Little by little, it became a tool of control. In 1086, William the Conqueror ordered a massive census of England, now known as the Domesday Book. For the first time on that scale, a government needed to know precisely who every person was, how much land they owned, and how much tax they owed. Over time, that purely bureaucratic need helped popularize something we now take completely for granted, the hereditary surname. It didn't appear so that you could know who you were. It appeared so that the state could know who you were. On the other side of the world, the Chinese surname system had already been functioning for thousands of years, originally tied to clans and family lineages long before most European families had fixed surnames, and history repeats itself in much darker forms. During colonization and slavery, millions of people had their original names taken away and were given new ones, chosen by those who controlled them. Something similar happened generations later in residential schools created for indigenous children in various countries, where the first step, often on the very first day, was to replace the name they arrived with an entirely different one. It wasn't simply an administrative detail. It was often the first step toward erasing who you had been before that date. A name can be the most intimate gesture that exists between two people. And at the same time, it can be the coldest weapon there is. And if you think having a fixed surname is universal, there are still entire societies today that don't work that way. In Iceland, most people do not use hereditary family surnames. Instead, they use patronymics. The name simply ends with son of or daughter of, followed by the father's name, or sometimes the mother's. So two siblings can literally have different surnames from one another. Something similar happens in Indonesia. Millions of people use a single name without any surname at all. Former Presidents Sukarno and Suharto are two of the best-known examples. A single name with no surname throughout their entire public lives. This isn't a bureaucratic mistake or a curious exception. It's proof that the system you probably grew up with, first name plus inherited surname, perhaps with a middle name, isn't the only possible way to solve the problem of knowing who is who in a group of thousands or millions of people. It's simply one of several different solutions that different cultures developed, each in their own way, to solve the same human problem. How do you distinguish one specific person from everyone else? And this is where everything becomes completely personal. In 1959, psychologist Neville Murray conducted a simple but revealing experiment. He played a different audio recording into each person's ear, a technique now known as dichotic listening, and asked them to pay attention to only one of the two, in theory, the second audio track should have become nothing more than background noise, something completely ignored. But when that second audio track, the one nobody was supposed to be listening to, said the person's own name, nearly 1/3 of the participants noticed it immediately. Your brain, without you asking it to, is always listening for your name, even when it's completely occupied with something else, even when it believes it isn't paying attention to anything at all. There's something else. In 1985, Belgian psychologist Joseph Nutin discovered that most people, without realizing it, prefer the letters that make up their own name over other letters of the alphabet. He called this the name-letter effect. It isn't conscious vanity. It's something much more automatic. Your name isn't simply a label you use to introduce yourself. It's part of how your brain constructs every single day who you are. Various neuroimaging studies have found that when people hear their own names, brain regions associated with self-awareness become activated differently than when they hear other words, including other proper names that aren't their own. At some level, your brain knows how to distinguish your name from every other name in the world. Even in medical settings, this appears to hold true. Various studies in intensive care units have found that sedated patients, who barely respond to external stimuli, sometimes show a measurable reaction when someone says their name, a slight change in brain activity, even when the person is not consciously aware of it. Apparently, your name is one of the last things your brain stops recognizing, and this connects directly to something we mentioned earlier. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar of the University of Oxford spent years comparing the brain size of different primates with the size of their social groups. His conclusion, now famous both inside and outside academia, was that the human brain has a kind of natural limit for stable relationships, around 150 people. That number again. It isn't a coincidence. It is practically the same size as the bands in which our species lived for most of its history. So what really happens when the name disappears completely? The answer is simpler than you think. People change. In 1976, a group of psychologists led by Edward Diener conducted an experiment on Halloween night. At some houses, children asking for candy were asked their names before being allowed to take a piece from a bowl. At other houses, they weren't asked anything at all. They remained completely anonymous, often wearing costumes. And often in groups. The children who were asked their names almost never broke the rule of taking just one piece of candy. The anonymous children, on the other hand, took much more frequently, some taking several handfuls instead of just one. The name, by itself, functioned almost like an invisible surveillance camera. We think anonymity will set us free. But here's what we lost. When nobody knows your name, nobody is really seeing you. They're only seeing another body in the darkness, among other bodies. And without that weight, the silent weight of being recognized, of being specifically called by your name, something in human behavior simply loosens. Think about the platforms you use every day. A comment signed with your real name almost always sounds different, more careful, more measured than that same comment written behind a made-up username, without a photo, without anything connecting you to it. Technology completely changed the setting. The psychological mechanism remains exactly the same as it was in 1976. So put all of this together for a moment. Dolphins with their own whistles, reserved for a single individual, elephants calling one another with something resembling a name, a body carefully buried 60,000 years ago because someone mattered enough. Names that could not be spoken out of pure respect. Names imposed centuries later as a means of control. An Icelandic patronymic that changes with every generation. A single name without a surname for entire presidents of a country. Nearly 1/3 of your brain still listening for your own name in any crowded, noisy room. And that number 150 appearing again and again, from the earliest bands of our species to the real limits of your own mind. Here's the idea I want to leave you with. You don't forget the name of that person you met 5 seconds ago because you're careless or because you don't care enough. You forget it because your brain is still operating, even today, with the software of a village of 150 people, and you live every day surrounded by thousands. A world completely without names never really existed, not even in the smallest, oldest, most forgotten band in our history, because at some point, tens of thousands of years ago, someone looked at another person and decided that they mattered enough to distinguish them from everyone else. And they gave them a sound reserved only for them. Every name you still remember today remains exactly that, a small act of belonging.